Nobody actually wants the globe to stop revolving, but there are multiple challenges to the health of the planet and its inhabitants which have prompted you to pursue, and that's a very modest word. You don't say it's a framework for a new politics or a blueprint for a new politics, but a pursuit of the new politics.
These four legs, as I see it, of the new way we're going to govern ourselves in the post-nation-state world. It expects there still to be strong national governments, but it expects that the strength of those national governments will come from their confidence and vision to delegate power up to the global level where they can't solve problems anymore on their own, to delegate power down to the local level, because as someone who's lived in cities like New York and London, I realize that often the mayor of those cities is a much more powerful influence on the lives of those of us who live in his city than national politicians sometimes are. And above all, it's a call for the empowerment of civil society, this recognition that so many of the global problems, we got to a solution because of the powerful advocacy and leadership of a development non-governmental organization like Oxfam or Save the Children, or because of the power of the international human rights community, which were willing to speak out in a way that mealy-mouthed governments and international organizations were not. And the power of enlightened business leaders to participate with those groups, often their apparent natural adversaries, to kind of find solutions to global problems that governments couldn't bestir themselves to do. And much of our national lives is being, for better or worse, globalized. How many others too can embrace that same global life. And I feel very strongly it doesn't need to be through the United Nations, or it doesn't even need to be through a non-governmental organization. It can be making an international career in the law or business or medicine or so many other areas. It's just that willingness to understand that the fulfilled life today is, in many more cases than ever in the past, going to be a global life. Where you serve a global community, whether as a healthcare provider or through the businesses that you work in. Countries with the right kind of leadership have second chances. In 1965, Ghana was richer than South Korea. Many times in my lifetime, Brazil has been declared as on an unstoppable path towards economic success. 20 years ago, the country from Asia which was going to knock the United States off its pedestal was Japan. I've watched countries which didn't succeed in the way that was predicted, nevertheless pick themselves up. Ghana is now growing very strongly and is well governed and has gone through several competitive elections and is weaning down its dependence on aid and borrows money on the international financial markets and is on its way to start nipping a gang at the heels of South Korea. And why it's done it is good leadership, a great democratic political culture that's developing, and that what began with Margaret Thatcher and went to Ronald Reagan in the US of this big push towards economic liberalization, of course became a global phenomenon with the World Bank and others pressing countries to divest themselves of state enterprises, to liberalize their markets, reduce import barriers, with, at the time, some really devastating effects on the economies of particularly poorer countries. I saw these two interlinked strands of democratization and economic liberalization, country by country, change the face of the global economy with an unanticipated result, which we call globalization, because suddenly this extraordinary force of economic integration started to reshape what we consumed, how we worked, how we voted, how we thought. The phenomenon of globalization is, in my view, irreversible. And so how do we manage it? And I argue that institutions like the United Nations, we're sort of lucky to have them around, formed under the very different circumstances of 1945, but that every time those in them and those in the governments represented at them have gathered enough courage to think of refitting the UN to take on some of these modern challenges. There's rarely been the political will, and certainly never in a sustained way. So we've never built a United Nations or international governance system fit for purpose. I argue we need to. We've arrived at a point where we're having to deal with these dramatic changes in relations between countries, dramatic period of wealth creation of a scale we've never seen in world history before, dramatic increases in global population and life expectancy, that we're dealing with all of this in a world which is more integrated than ever before, but less governed than ever before, because it's undermined the traditional nation-state way of managing our affairs, but not substituted anything instead. It's not a case for a kind of world parliament or a world government that there's clearly not in, I think, any of our lifetimes going to be anything like a constituency for that, and perhaps, I think, likely never, ever will be. But what instead it calls for is for politicians to recognize the global dimensions to their national jobs, to understand, as they were forced to in 2008 during the financial crisis, that they couldn't solve it alone. George Bush in the US and Sarkozy and Merkel in Europe, they all realized they were in the same lifeboat, going down together or staying afloat together. And they particularly realized that that lifeboat no longer had the 8 passengers of the G8 in it, but needed Brazil and South Africa and India and the fuller G20. So it took crisis to drive home that level of global interdependence of our financial system, and it took crisis to at least take some first steps towards addressing it and giving a little bit of authority and standing to the G20. But of course, as soon as the crisis recedes, so too does the will to build this kind of modern governance. So I run through the checklist of disappointments that we are still not able to manage outbreaks of global of communicable diseases in an effective way, let alone deal with some of the categories of non-communicable disease. We still allow a lot too much poverty out there in what is this small integrated global neighborhood. As long as we go on viewing it as some kind of big-sized, super-sized version of national government, we're not going to collect the will to do it. But if instead we can look at it as empowering these coalitions of NGOs and foundations and like-minded governments who are willing to seize an issue and run with it, then on everything, not just from the financial crisis, but to things like landmines, or whether it is dealing with certain aspects of climate change, you're still going to need the UN at a minimum to kind of endorse, legitimize, be a platform where these deals, if you like, get confirmed, that it could understand this changing nature of international politics, find ways to include civil society and business in its deliberations, overcome the kind of formulaic interstate business model that it presently has imposed on it by governments, and really become the dynamic, opportunistic place where we can start finding solutions to world problems. But that will come, I suspect, and argue through the enterprise of its leaders and through individual diplomats with the vision to do this. We've just got so much to fix if we're to live up to the potential that the economic and demographic and social changes of the last 30, 40 years has created.
Successive Secretary Generals over the decades have tried to initiate reform and have not really succeeded. What kind of catastrophe will it take for the UN to be made operable in the way that you would see fit?
Well, I mean, the analogy is if it took a financial crisis to make the G20 operable, it's probably going to need some massive security crisis to make the UN operable, because that's what happened, which led to San Francisco and the original charter. It was, a historic moment in which the exhausted allies of World War II, recognized they needed to create a more robust, sustainable, burden-shared, power-shared world for afterwards, and particularly the United States, anxious that it not inherit the burden of world policemen from Europe. We have a new group of countries who similarly are being looked to pick up the baton of sharing in global security arrangements, and that's countries like India and China and Brazil. This is a moment to kind of think, well, look, if the UN or something like it could be turned into a place where there was a genuine burden sharing of security, so that people aren't looking to us to go and keep the peace in Lebanon, but we're just asked to send a battalion along with the Americans and the Indians and the Brazilians. Well, maybe that's an affordable tax on us that we could live with. So I think as this power shift goes on, the right kind of, if you like, diplomatically entrepreneurial UN leadership can kind of seize the moment to bring the Chinas and Indias much more centrally into the UN. But it's not obvious it will happen.